The opioid crisis continues to rage on across our country, killing thousands every year. A documentary has been produced discussing this very important subject and how it has impacted so many communities. The documentary, called Vancouver is Dying, premiered in October and has now garnered over 2 million views on YouTube. The host and camera crew walked the streets of Vancouver, BC without a filter, showing what life is like in those tent cities and hearing firsthand how opioids have impacted so many. Here is a sneak peek.
People are afraid in Vancouver. You shouldn't have to walk down the street looking over your shoulder, but that's the way it is now.
You just kind of get used to this being part of what it means to be a Vancouverite. This isn't normal, and this is actually something wrong, and that we should hold our political leaders accountable for presiding over something that is clearly not okay.
We had a good city in the 90s. What the f happened, man?
What is happening to Vancouver? One of the wealthiest and most naturally beautiful cities in all of North America has been beset by skyrocketing crime, violent attacks, and a crippling battle with addiction that's literally left thousands of people dead. But what is at the root of all these problems? Do police have the tools they need to do their jobs? Are violent offenders being released with little to no regard for public safety? And has an ideological obsession with so-called safe supply and free drugs overshadowed the desperate need for treatment, recovery, and rehabilitation?
Harm reduction. Somebody's got a sense of humor, man. Because that shit ain't helping nobody, man. It's helping everybody get high more.
Everywhere you look that this stuff has taken hold significantly, the cities have become destroyed.
Wow, just a different side of Vancouver. Now joining me is Canadian filmmaker and producer Gunn. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us on Bridge City News today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Aaron, let's get started. What inspired you to begin researching the backstory behind the current opioid crisis impacting Vancouver?
Well, the big thing to me was I noticed a huge disconnect. Talking to friends, family, people that work in Vancouver, that obviously whatever we were doing wasn't working. The problem was getting worse. Crime was getting worse. Open drug use was rampant. And yet the politicians seemed to think that everything was going okay. The policies that we were doing were having results. And the only issue was we weren't going far enough. And I noticed that there was a disconnect there, that the rhetoric and the evidence on the ground wasn't matching up. And we wanted to do a little bit of old school investigative journalism and try to connect the dots and find out exactly what was happening.
We were just chatting before this interview how these images that you have in this documentary just don't line up with the way I personally experienced Vancouver in the 90s, and even that one lady saying, you know, what the happened. So what is it like to live there? Your documentary paints a picture where even nice neighborhoods are plagued with random acts of violence.
Yeah, so what used to be contained to what's known as the downtown east side has been spreading out to other areas. If you know Vancouver, you know, areas like Gastown, Kitsilano, and Yaletown will be familiar to you. These are areas obviously that are nice neighborhoods that have very high property values. People pay and have paid a lot of money to live there. And these issues have basically been spiraling out of the downtown east side. There's open drug use all over the place in all different parts of Vancouver. And probably the scariest part is, as you alluded to, these what are known as random stranger attacks. And there's on average 4 random stranger attacks every day in Vancouver. These are people that are walking around minding their own business who are getting violently assaulted. And so we wanted to look into why that was happening. And because it's a cause for concern to many people living in Vancouver. And we interviewed, including a mother of one of the victims of these random stranger attacks, who was walking around Kitsilano in the evening, which is a real upscale neighborhood of Vancouver, and was brutally assaulted by 2 men, had to have facial surgery and things like that. It was a very sad story.
I know I've heard a lot of random stranger attacks here in Lethbridge, and of course, like Lethbridge, no doubt has a very significant opioid crisis here as well. I appreciate how the documentary made an effort to highlight those who are in recovery as well. What was the biggest thing you learned after speaking with those who are struggling with addiction?
Well, one thing I will say is we went into this documentary, producing this documentary, seeing the problems firsthand that were happening on the street, but there were some things that really shocked us. And the most revealing interviews for sure were both the people that were still living on the streets in the downtown east side in Vancouver, and also those who were recently and have since recovered. And one of the things that that shocked me was, you may have heard this. After making this documentary, I think it's an oxymoron. This term "safe supply," which is basically the government providing what are notionally less dangerous opioids at taxpayers' expense to addicts. And one of the two things that we heard that shocked me the most is the individuals who were most antagonized back by that, who were most opposed to that, were those who were in recovery or who have gone through the recovery process and were sober,
Wow.
who
Oh,
told me point blank, and this isn't just one person, this is over and over again, who told me point blank, if this kind of policy existed while they were on the streets, they would still be on the streets. And the second part was talking to a homeless gentleman in Vancouver, how these safe supply drugs were being basically handed out like candy on Halloween to addicts who were then selling these drugs to their drug dealers or exchanging them for fentanyl, which is the drug that they actually wanted. And then these notionally less harmful substances were being resold on university campuses, college campuses, even high schools. So finding that out was really shocking.
so for safe supply, it's almost like giving people currency to go purchase whatever illicit substance they want.
Yeah, so what shocked me was going into this documentary, you hear a lot about the drug poisoning crisis. That was terminology that was used a lot. So what I had envisioned, and this is pertaining particularly to fentanyl, was that people went to purchase other drugs and then were shocked to find that fentanyl was in them, and then they overdosed or whatever. And then what I found out was actually in the majority of cases, fentanyl is being sought out. Like these individuals who are sick are addicted to fentanyl itself, and this is what's being sought out. So when these safe supply programs were being set up, which basically handed out drugs without preconditions, slightly less toxic drugs, the addicts would just get these and resell them to their dealers to get money to purchase fentanyl, which is the drug that they were addicted to. It's the high that they were addicted to and seeking out. So that really shocked me and really changed my perspective on the entire situation.
Wow, that's shocking to hear. Now let's talk about how EMS and police have been dealing with the opioid crisis. What has it been like for those you interviewed?
Well, the police, I think there's a couple things on that front. The police that I spoke to, retired VPD officer and the head of the Vancouver Police Union. First and foremost, they don't feel supported by City Hall at all and politicians, whether they be at a municipal or provincial level. Now, I will say, a week and a half after this documentary, when it had about 250,000 views, there was a big municipal election in Vancouver, and the incumbent mayor got beaten pretty badly by almost 20%, which is kind of unprecedented in the history of Vancouver. So hopefully things are starting to change. But as it stood, the Vancouver police felt not supported. They're under-resourced, and maybe most importantly, they feel as if their hands are tied on dealing with this. And the number one point on that isn't so much the police, but the justice system. So I talked to police officers over and over again who some cases would arrest an individual for whatever crime it may be. They'd be booked by the justice system, and then they'd be released on a promise to appear, which they would never appear for. And in some instances, that same police officer would arrest the same individual for the same crime twice within 24 hours. And it was this literal
Wow.
revolving door system. And there's some incredible stat where it's just a couple dozen individuals that are responsible for 75% of the crime in Vancouver, because you just have between the judges and some of our laws, this revolving door where the people are allowed to commit crimes over and over again with virtual impunity.
Now, how does the mainstream media play into all of this? Do you believe there is a willingness to ignore the facts and just support the government-approved policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple issues. I think there's politicians that have up to now failed to find the political courage to take a stand on this issue. And then you just see with the mainstream media, like you do on so many issues, this kind of uniform opinion making, where they all just start echoing each other and speaking from or singing from the same song sheet, as it were. And you see that when it comes to issues like harm reduction, like safe supply. You see it in the media. You've got kind of these we'll call them left-wing groups, because it's probably the most accurate way to describe them, who come up with these euphemisms for various policies, like safe supply, like you can't call them safe injection sites anymore, you call them overdose prevention sites. And the media all too often just basically copy and paste that narrative supplied to them and just goes along with it. And but the thing is the facts don't lie. So 20 years ago, when these policies surrounding harm reduction started, because there was a crisis in Vancouver and BC, you were looking at about 150 deaths from overdose every single year. Now, after 20 years of harm reduction in BC, we're at over 2,000 deaths per year. So the facts don't lie, the figures don't lie. Obviously, the policy hasn't been working, and anyone that's been living in downtown Vancouver or working there can see firsthand that it hasn't been working.
Now, you mentioned that the mainstream media and politicians are singing off the same song sheet, to quote you. What are some of the potential solutions politicians have proposed in dealing with the addiction and homeless issues in the Lower Mainland?
Well, up until quite recently, all politicians have been saying is that we haven't been going enough. We haven't thrown enough money at the problem. We need to buy up what's happened in BC. They were buying up all these hotels during COVID and trying to warehouse addicts and homeless people in them, which had disastrous consequences, especially for the neighborhoods surrounding those purchased hotels and for the addicts themselves. Now, starting to see some things change at the federal level. Pierre Poilievre did a video in Vancouver speaking out on these issues, calling out quote unquote safe supply as an oxymoron that wasn't working, and talking about instead of handing out free drugs, focusing on recovery and treatment and really returning these individuals, rehabilitating them and returning them to being productive, tax-paying members of society again, which I think has to be our goal. And I think actually that's the compassionate goal, because what we're doing now, warehousing them off in some shanty hotel somewhere and throwing free drugs at them notionally in perpetuity, I don't see how that is the compassionate solution. I don't see how that's good for taxpayers. I don't see how that's good for anybody. It's like we've managed to find a lose-lose-lose situation.
You know, many Canadians may not be aware of just how deep and widespread public policies of harm reduction go. What have you witnessed?
Well, in Vancouver, this is, so people understand, this is pretty much the capital of quote unquote harm reduction policies in the world. Vancouver considers themselves, and the people behind these policies consider themselves on the cutting edge. And they've certainly gone to places that no one else has gone before. The amount of open drug use, obviously, BC and the federal government under Justin Trudeau signed an agreement to decriminalize all drugs, or hard drugs, which has allowed dealers to move things like fentanyl and crack and other substance, crystal meth, much more easily. You have a rapid expansion of safe injection sites, or what they like to call overdose prevention sites. And then you have what they view as kind of the ultimate harm reduction, which is safe supply, which is handing out free drugs with little to no barriers. You don't need to, be on some kind of medical treatment plan. You basically just go and sign up for it. And, you get what's essentially off-market heroin provided for the government, provided by the government, paid for by taxpayers, and supplied in perpetuity. So, that's the full extent of harm reduction fully realized. The one thing these activists would like to see it go even farther would be for the government to provide actual fentanyl to these addicts, which we're not there yet, but never say never in the way things have been going in Vancouver.
Now, in Lethbridge here, when a supervised consumption site closed, there were a lot of individuals that were displaced. Vancouver's users are on a much bigger scale. What do you think could happen?
Well, I think the what needs to happen or what should happen. I mean, the supervised consumption sites, individuals aren't living there, so so there's two things. One, I mean, we need to get more treatment and recovery facilities, and we need to get these people in treatment and recovery facilities because that's where they should be. They're sick. Addiction is a mental illness. They are addicted to these substances, and I view that compassionately as part of a holistic kind of healthcare approach. And healthcare is provided for by the government in this country. So I think we need to help get these people better again and well again and off these dangerous toxic substances. Now, the other thing is part of the other approach that maybe you were kind of alluding to there is the alternate approach of not trying to get these individuals off of these substances and instead warehousing them in perpetuity at what are called SROs, single resident occupancy, these hotels, these buildings that the government has bought up. And problem there's a couple issues. I mean, for one thing, if you're trying to get clean and you're living in one of these places, good luck. We interviewed one addict who got clean for a month and then needed a place to live, and the government sent him to one of these hotels that they had purchased. And he said within 10 minutes, he had 3 knocks on his door from people trying to sell him drugs. And by the end of the night, he had relapsed again. So that's the kind of situation that we are putting these sick people, and some of them trying to get clean, trying to turn their lives around. We're making it worse and worse and worse with all of our decisions. The other issue that's important to note is part of the homeless issue, at least in BC. I can't speak to Alberta quite as much, but at least in BC, is there are spots, there are places for some of these homeless people to live, but they actually would prefer to live on the street or prefer to live in tent cities because a lot of these buildings come with some basic rules of you can't be doing drugs in the hallway, or you can't be being up to certain other shenanigans in the evenings, and these individuals would actually prefer to live on the street or in tent city. And what they're demanding and what the activist groups demand is actually housing without preconditions and without rules, and kind of Lord of the Flies, laissez-faire, do whatever you want, which obviously is not sustainable and not fair and not reasonable to taxpayers.
Just a very, very sad situation. Aaron Gunn, filmmaker and producer of the documentary Vancouver is Dying. It's available on YouTube. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you for having me.